Welcome students to another edition of Aaron Does an Economics Paper. Today it's Tuesday the 12th of June from 2012 at 5:84. Let's have a look at the case study. British Airways moves a step closer to transatlantic deal. So what we've got here is British Airways has taken a significant step towards securing an alliance with American Airlines after the European competition approved it. So why would they be needing to approve it? They must have had some potential impact on competition. Alliances are that thing in the long-haul market where airlines don't buy each other out but work together to share routes. If the three-way tie-up with American Airlines and Spanish airline Iberia is agreed, so three companies involved in this by the US Department of Transport, the airlines will in effect be allowed to agree on fares and scheduling between the Europe and US. So it's kind of legal collusion. So they're going to be able to set fares that are the same and then also determine the scheduling, which is the landing slots, the taking off slots. Willie Walsh, BA Chief Executive, said the route between Heathrow and the US, so we've got the infrastructure there, Heathrow is already competitive thanks to the Open Skies deal. That was the deal that between the European Union and the US deregulated the markets and allowed greater competition, more people entering into the markets. Virgin Atlantic, which has emblazoned its aircraft with slogans protesting against the deal, so Virgin is a competitor to these, said it would continue to fight the proposal. Richard Branson said, "We have fought this monster monopoly for the past 13 years and are still resolute in our belief." So Richard Branson's basically saying that BA is a monopoly and it being allowed to have an alliance is reducing the competition in the market. Okay, so analysts and investors believe that the deal will lead to lower costs. So we've potentially got some economies of scale going on here because the combined scheduling allows it to fly fewer planes. At the same time, the three airlines will not have to duplicate sales teams for customers. So they're going to spread the sales team out, flying fewer planes in total. So that kind of goes against economies of scale. But the sales team, the marketing function being spread out is definitely economy of scale. The main benefits would not come from price increases, so they're promising that it's going to be no increases in fares and that they're going to be more profitable from reducing costs. So he's saying that there'll be no reduction in no increase in the prices for consumers and just productive efficiency because they're going to be saving money and that's where they'll get their profits from. The table here is showing market shares. So you've got British Airways with 37%, which is effectively over 25% a monopoly. EasyJet 15%, nowhere near. Virgin 13%, 11, 9, 5 and 3 and so on. So you've got concentration ratios there that could be calculated. Okay, so first question we've got, what is meant by a 5-firm concentration ratio? 1 mark, it's just the percentage of market share of the 5 largest firms added together. Next one, it looks at calculate the 5-firm concentration ratio in the UK to 1 decimal place. If we go back up to the screen above, 5 largest firms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So those added together is going to give you 85.9. So the 5-firm concentration in that market is showing that it's very heavily an oligopoly. The next question is looking at the impact on the market concentration of the merger. So the merger is between Thomson Airways and Thomas Cook Airways. So Thomson Airways there and Thomas Cook, you would be adding together those two now, but then that means that the 5-firm, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now Monarch becomes the 5th one. So you're adding 5.3 to that. So you're now going to get a concentration ratio of 91.2. The other key part to this question is that it's saying explain the impact. So if you've just calculated that it's 91.2, there is one of the marks, which is for saying what that means. Now, it's either an increase in concentration or a reduction in competition. Those things being an inverse relationship, but both of those are correct for that question. The next question's now looking at costs. Explain the difference between fixed and variable costs. The key word that the markers are going to be looking for is output. So fixed costs are ones that don't change with output, but variable costs do. So that's the key for the 2 marks. They identify one fixed and one variable. A nice fixed cost to use would be something like a building, or fixed capital like an airplane. So that's something that you've paid that isn't going to change no matter how many flights that you fly. Variable costs, things like fuel, meals, those things are things that change depending on the number of flights that you fly. The next question is looking at economies of scale. So state and explain 2 possible economies of scale. You want to bring each question, or the last thing you're going to talk about, is how it reduces average cost. But you're either going to talk about fixed costs being spread out, or a reduction in the actual fixed and variable costs. If you go for purchasing economies of scale, you're going to look at one of those 2. So getting the planes cheaper, or getting the fuel cheaper from bulk buying. And remember, the key to bulk buying is negotiation. If you are, another good one to do would be marketing, because as you spend money on advertising, it's not linked to the output. So you're spreading the fixed costs out of the advertising over more flights, and that's what's reducing the average cost. This question is looking at a comment question. So there's a little bit of explaining why it does, but also a little bit of explaining why it doesn't. Whether an airline, so it is a mode, may suffer from diseconomies of scale as it expands. The expansion for an airline would be putting on more flights to the same destinations. So British Airways travelling to New York more times. Diseconomies of scale, the opposite of the evaluation you've just looked at. So it's explaining why average costs would rise. So you've got those motivation, industrial relations, communication and coordination. Talk about those. Key things to mention though are waste, so that staff make more mistakes, it costs them in waste. They'll pay more compensation, or that productivity decreases. And those are the things that are going to increase average costs. The reason why it might not comes down to that average cost curve, and it depends where you start. So if you start over here at a low level of output, you've still got output to increase, and you won't get to diseconomies of scale until you get here. If you do start at this point, it's much more likely that you're going to get diseconomies of scale. So nice way to do that one, it depends where you start, because you might not get diseconomies of scale. Okay, this question is a discuss question. It's on the first part of the paper, so it's only an 8 marker. Take about 15 to 16 minutes to do this. The extent to which deregulation, so extent to which it wants a judgment. Deregulation, this could come as into this part in terms of competition. Regulation is about solving market failures. Deregulation is the one that's looking about competition. It's given you an example here of the EU's open skies policy, but because it says such as, you could use deregulation of the bus market as well. And it's saying beneficial to transport markets. So you know that it's opened up competition within the markets. You're effectively doing an essay along the lines of a discuss whether or not a monopoly is beneficial, discuss whether or not competition is beneficial. You're coming back to the arguments of yes, it increases efficiencies, or no, it doesn't. Because it's only an 8 marker, probably, one, if you've got time, two, reasons why that increase in competition, which you will get from more firms entering the market, would cause those efficiencies. So competition forces businesses to put their costs down. It's mentioned in the case study that they try and get their costs down. Allocative efficiency, the greater competition would lead to lower prices and greater quantity for the business and for the consumer. Dynamic efficiency, trying to stay ahead of their competition through providing better service. But competition means that the size of the businesses are smaller, so you don't get economies of scale for productive efficiency. It may be oversupply in terms of allocative efficiency, and you don't have the profits for dynamic efficiency. The easiest it depends upon is contestability, because even if you have got a monopoly, threats of entry will make them behave, but you can also make a judgment on the different markets. So you've got the long haul and the short haul. You could say that deregulation has worked more in that market, but you've also got bus inside London and outside London you could use as an example where regulation has actually made the situation better. Okay, here we have the second part. So you've done your first 50 minutes, you've got an hour and 10 minutes for this section. Questions are in parts, so 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B, 4A, 4B. First one, analyse the methods used by economists to place monetary values on externalities. What this one needs is you to give examples of what the shadow costs are. So you've got the examples here of the externalities themselves, and you need to explain how those monetary values are arrived at. Some of the methods, so if it's noise, it could be the cost of insulation or double glazing. So you have to spend the money on that. The costs of those are easy to calculate. When it comes to congestion, you're looking at the opportunity cost of time. But again, you've got different types of time. You've got work time, you've got commuting time, and you've got leisure time. So you could talk about how the values of those are estimated. One thing you also need to take into account of is demand, because you need to know and forecast demand through those methods we've looked at, Delphi method and so on, because the size of these costs depend upon how much we're going to use those different modes of transport. And because it says arising from increased transport use, it's asking you to say, well, if transport's increasing, how do you know it's increasing? So we need to forecast demand and then multiply that by the shadow costs of noise and congestion. It could be accidents, it could be air pollution as well. So you need examples of what they are, how the costs are given, and then talk about forecasts of demand. That's quite a challenging one, but the second part of that question is really straightforward. It's a discuss question, 20 marks on subsidies. So you draw your subsidy graph. Yes, it's effective because it lowers the costs or production costs to a business. It allows them to increase their supply. This increases consumer surplus. Price falls, quantity rises, more people take public transport. And the key to this question is this part here, overcoming market failure. So you're talking about how it reduces demand for cars. This question isn't just about getting people on public transport. The specific of the question is to reduce the market failure of cars. So you need to really focus on a modal switch to specifically answer this question. So a modal switch from cars to public transport. The arguments against, you've got inelastic demand. You've also got the fact that it's seen as an inferior good, and as incomes rise, it'll be less likely that people travel by bus. Then for the it depends upon, combine the policies. So road user charging or a tax on cars, that will reduce the demand for cars. It'll make the cross elasticity greater, so the switch between cars and buses becomes more effective. The next question is the section, and there always is a section on competition. First one's talking about the characteristics of monopolistic competition. The minimum you should do is one graph. So probably the short run. I know this isn't a great graph, but if you can also do the long run, and you can use it to explain different features between the two graphs. Because you've got low barriers to entry, this means that, and give examples of those low barriers to entry, so lack of economies of scale and so on, but this means that there is more competition in the market, more firms, which creates elastic demand, and that's the thing that's going to bring the price down and increase the total market quantity. Now, that's some of the features, but analysing that and referring to the graph, but also giving examples. You need AO2 in that question, so apply that to the markets. The best markets for monopolistic competition are either short haul A or the taxi market. This question is very similar to the deregulation question, but it's flipped around. So the extent to which a monopoly is beneficial. So again, allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, and dynamic. Yes and no, and then it depends upon contestability. Again, you need to give examples because it doesn't say. So your monopolies can be things like the rail market or the long haul A. Allocative efficiency, because they will not overproduce, so there's no waste. Productive efficiency, economies of scale. Dynamic efficiency, abnormal profits reinvested. But, and what is likely is that they will profit maximize, so the price will go up and the quantity will go down because of inelastic demand. They don't have to achieve economies of scale, so they'll produce at a low quantity, and those profits end up back in the hands of their shareholders. And last but not least, question 4, explain why the passenger transport and freight transport is derived demand. Two separate parts of the question here, passenger and freight. Discuss the problems of forecasting future trends in transport. So first question, analyze why transport and freight demand is derived. What you want to do is give the examples of the purpose of journeys. So once you've defined derived demand, demand not for the mode but for what it allows you to do, look at some of the purposes, leisure, work, education, and talk about how increases in, for example, income lead to an increase in the demand for leisure, because leisure is a luxury good. As the demand for leisure increases, more passenger journeys take place. Nice way of getting some economic theory in there, probably a nice supply and demand graph to show the increase in demand. The freight transport one is a little bit different, but again you can link it to incomes, because as incomes rise, demand for goods and services rise, especially the luxury ones. There is a need for those goods and services to be transported around the economy, so that leads to more derived demand for transport. This one's a bit of a challenge. Discuss the problems of forecasting future trends in transport markets. What you've got here is slightly different to some of the other discussed questions. What you've got on one side is how the forecasting takes place, and then on the other side you've got what the problems are, but analysed. And then the thing that we'd evaluate would be solutions to those problems. So the how is you're predicting trends in demand. So demand is what we're going to do. So we'd choose a market because you need to apply it to a market. Say it's the bus market. And what you would talk about is using, say, correlation. And you would be correlating income to demand. So what you need to know is it a luxury good? Is it inferior good? And so on. Then you would be predicting the increase in incomes based on GDP estimates. So we'd estimate that the economy is going to grow 3%, that if the elasticity for demand is 2, the YED, income elasticity of demand, then an increase in incomes of, let's say, 20% would lead to an increase in demand for a road of 40%. It's a pretty extreme example, but you kind of get where I'm going with that one. So what you need is A, the forecasting method, B, what the changes that you're forecasting, and C, how that affects demand. So it's a factors affecting demand question as well. Extrapolation, you could be looking at the trends in population, and again that change in population may lead to an extrapolation of the demand for cars. Other things that you can use to predict the demand for transport can be the taxes and subsidies on different modes, so you're using XED there to predict it. You could also look at predictions in the price of complements, so the price of fuel, that might determine demand as well. The problems come down to things like uncertainty, but link it into the change that you've been analysing. So if you're looking at the uncertainty of GDP forecasts, you could say that the economy may go into a recession. If you're looking at the problems with the Delphi method, you could look into it as it's only an opinion. The solutions tend to be to combine the methods. So you combine the methods. You either predict only the short term, so not the long term, or you get more variables to predict the demand. So you just use more variables to get an accuracy of the demand. But the key judgment has to be that forecasts have to be made. So we have to provide infrastructure in the future, and it takes time to build. So unless we know what the demand's likely to be, we're going to create output gaps within our economy. Okay, hopefully that's been useful for you. I'll create another one on Monday. I'll also send you an email of the revision for next week.